The most sacred man in prehistoric Europe was the product of incest. His parents were either a brother and sister or a parent and a child. And the people who built him the greatest monument in the ancient world knew it. They knew, and they carved a cathedral of stone for him anyway, because in their cosmology, this wasn't a crime. It was a credential. That's where we're starting, and by the time this is over, you'll understand why. Newgrange sits in the Boyne Valley of Ireland, roughly 45 minutes north of Dublin. If you've never seen it, picture a circular mound of white quartz and dark water-rolled stones, roughly 80 meters across and 12 meters tall. It looks almost like a spaceship that landed in a field and refused to leave. It was built around 3,200 BCE. That makes it older than Stonehenge by about 500 years. Older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by 6 centuries. It is, by any reasonable metric, one of the most sophisticated architectural achievements of the ancient world. And it does something almost impossible. Every year, on the morning of the winter solstice, December 21st, a narrow shaft of sunlight enters through a carefully engineered opening above the main doorway called the roof box. That shaft travels 19 meters down the stone corridor, through the darkness, and for exactly 17 minutes, it illuminates the central chamber with pure golden light. 17 minutes. Then it vanishes for another year. Think about what that required. No computers, no surveying equipment beyond what they could build by hand. Just human observation, accumulated over generations, translated into stone with absolute precision. These were not primitive people stumbling around in the dark. These were people with a sophisticated understanding of time, astronomy, and as it turns out, genetics. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists treated Newgrange as a kind of communal tomb, a place where the dead of a community were laid to rest. The bones inside, fragmented and scattered across the chamber and its 3 recessed alcoves, seemed to support that. Many people, many burials, a shared sacred space. But something about that story never quite fit. The scale of Newgrange is extraordinary. The labor required to build it, hauling those quartz stones from a quarry 60 kilometers away in County Wicklow, represents tens of thousands of person-hours of coordinated work. Communities don't do that for everyone. They do it for someone. And in 2020, a team of geneticists at Trinity College Dublin, led by researcher Lara Cassidy, decided to actually ask the bones who they belonged to. The technique they used is called ancient DNA analysis, and it works like this. Even in bones that are 5,000 years old, fragments of genetic material survive inside the dense inner walls of the petrous bone, the hardest bone in the human skull, which sits just behind the ear. From those fragments, scientists can reconstruct a genome, not perfectly, not completely, but well enough to answer specific questions. Who were you related to? Where did your ancestors come from? Were your parents closely related to each other? The Cassidy team extracted DNA from a dozen individuals found at Newgrange and 2 nearby passage tombs called Noth and Douth. They sent those genomes out to be compared against a database that had been assembled over the previous decade, thousands of ancient DNA samples from across Europe, the Near East, and Central Asia. The largest comparative dataset ever assembled for prehistoric human remains. And then they waited. When the results came back, 11 of the 12 individuals looked more or less as expected. They showed the genetic ancestry patterns typical of Neolithic farmers who had arrived in Ireland from continental Europe several centuries earlier. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make you stop and stare at a screen. The 12th individual was different. This person, a male, buried in the most prestigious spot in the Newgrange chamber, inside the alcove directly opposite the entrance. The alcove that gets hit by the solstice light carried a genetic signature that no one had seen before in the entire ancient European dataset. His genome showed what geneticists call runs of homozygosity, long identical stretches on both chromosomes. The kind of pattern you only see when both of a person's parents come from the same immediate family. Not the same clan, not the same village, the same household. His parents were either a full brother and sister, or a parent and a child. When the researchers ran this genome against thousands of comparative samples, Bronze Age Europeans, Neolithic farmers from across the continent, ancient populations from Turkey, from the Pontic steppe, from the Levant, the pattern they found in this man was essentially unique. In the entire ancient DNA database at that point, only a handful of individuals showed comparable evidence of first-degree incest. And every single one of them, when contextualized by the archaeology around them, turned out to be a person of extreme elite status. This is the fact. This one data point, this one genome, buried in the solstice chamber of the most elaborate monument in prehistoric Europe, showing a pattern of deliberate, intentional family union. And here is what it tells us. Across human history, there is a very specific context in which close-kin marriage appears among ruling classes. It is not poverty. It is not ignorance. It is divinity. The Egyptian pharaohs practiced sibling marriage, most famously in the case of Tutankhamun, whose parents were almost certainly a brother and sister. The Inca emperors, the Sapa Inca, were expected to marry their sisters because their bloodline was believed to carry the literal substance of the sun god Inti, and that substance could not be diluted through union with an ordinary person. The Hawaiian Ali'i Nui, the sacred chiefs, practiced what they called the Pio marriage, the highest-ranked union possible, between a brother and sister. Because the child of such a union was considered so sacred, they could not be looked upon directly by commoners. In each of these cases, the incest is not a corruption of power, it is the definition of it. If a divine bloodline is what sets you apart from everyone else, then the only way to preserve it perfectly is to never let it mix with anyone outside it. The logic is internally consistent, even if it is from a modern genetic standpoint catastrophic in the long run. But here's what's strange, what's genuinely strange. These cultures didn't know about each other. The Inca never met the pharaohs. The Hawaiian chiefs had no contact with the Boyne Valley. And yet they all arrived at the same solution to the same problem. How do you prove that your ruler is not just more powerful than everyone else, but ontologically different, not a better human, a different kind of being entirely? You make their origin impossible for an ordinary human to share. And now look at what the Irish mythology says. The Newgrange passage tomb in Irish literary tradition is called Brú na Boyne, the Palace of the Boyne. It is described not as a tomb, but as a living dwelling. In the medieval Irish texts, it is the home of the Dagda, the good god, the father figure of the Tuatha De Danann, the mythological divine race who supposedly inhabited Ireland before humans. The Dagda is described in the myths as engaging in sexual unions with his daughter. There are scholars who long dismissed this as later corruption of the texts, or as miscopied mythology. But when you hold that tradition up against the DNA evidence, something clicks. The people of Neolithic Ireland may not have thought of Newgrange as a tomb at all. They may have thought of it as a house, the house of a god. And the man buried in the solstice chamber, the man whose bones we just sequenced, may not have been a king in the way we think of kings. He may have been a living representative of the divine, a god-king whose sacred blood, born from an impossible union, made him something more than human. That's what the archaeologists started calling the Newgrange elite when the paper was published in Nature in 2020. The God Kings. Not as a dramatic flourish, but as a technical descriptor for a class of individual whose social status appears to have been based on a claim of divine origin, enforced and demonstrated through deliberate genetic isolation. And the really unsettling thing, the thing that should make you sit with this for a moment, is what this implies about the people who built Newgrange, the ordinary farmers, the ones who carried the quartz from Wicklow, the ones who aligned the roof box to within fractions of a degree. They were not enslaved. There is no evidence of coercion in the Neolithic Irish archaeological record. They did this willingly. They participated in a system where someone or something stood so far above them that no personal connection to the divine was even thinkable. This wasn't Egypt, with its armies and bureaucracies and written records. This was a small farming community on the western edge of the known world, 5,000 years ago. and they built their god a lighthouse that the sun visits once a year to say it remembers him. We think of ancient societies as simple, as pre-literate people stumbling towards civilization. But what the DNA from Newgrange tells us is something more uncomfortable. They had philosophy, they had theology, they had a worked-out theory of power and divinity that produced the same solution, independently, that other great civilizations would produce